The city moved as it always did. Cars honking, people rushing across intersections, the dull roar of life blending into a rhythm that most never noticed. Yet amid the noise and clutter of downtown, a boy sat quietly on the curb outside a tall glass building that seemed to scrape the clouds. His clothes were worn, his sandals nearly broken, and his small hands were cupped in front of him as if waiting for mercy to drop like coins. To the ordinary passerby he was invisible, just another beggar boy in a world where people had taught themselves to look away. But this boy was not ordinary, and his silence carried a weight far heavier than the coins he hoped for. His eyes did not dart nervously like the others. Instead, they scanned faces with a sharpness unusual for a child of his age, as though he was searching for someone specific. That morning, as the sun spilled golden light across the streets, a sleek black car pulled up to the building. From it stepped a man whose presence commanded attention without a single word. His suit was tailored, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the very ground he walked upon, and his expression bore the kind of authority that made others step aside. This was Jonathan Blake, a self-made millionaire whose empire spanned real estate, tech ventures, and international trade. To most he was a figure of admiration, a symbol of success, and to some even intimidation. But to the boy sitting on the curb, Jonathan was not just another powerful man. He was the moment he had been waiting for. The boy's gaze locked on Jonathan as he adjusted his cufflinks and turned to the back seat, helping his young daughter out of the car. She was fragile, her body thin, her legs resting in a wheelchair that had clearly been designed with both comfort and elegance. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her eyes were wide with the kind of innocence that had not yet been consumed by the harshness of life. But her condition was obvious. She could not walk, and perhaps had not for some time. Jonathan placed a tender hand on her shoulder, his stern face softening in a way that was rarely seen in boardrooms or on magazine covers. For in that moment he was not a millionaire, not a titan of industry, but simply a father. The boy rose slowly from his spot, brushing the dust from his trousers, and stepped forward. At first Jonathan didn't notice, too focused on his daughter's careful transition from car to wheelchair. But when the boy spoke, his voice, though soft, cut through the noise of the street like a blade. "Sir," the boy said, his accent laced with both humility and an unshakable conviction, "I can help your daughter walk again." Jonathan froze, his body stiffening as though the words had physically struck him. Slowly he turned, his sharp blue eyes narrowing at the sight of the frail child who dared to speak to him in such a bold manner. The words echoed in his mind, outrageous and impossible. Help his daughter walk again. He had spent millions of dollars consulting the best doctors across the globe. Specialists from Switzerland, surgeons from New York, rehabilitation experts from Germany, all had given him the same verdict. Her condition was irreversible. And yet here stood a boy in ragged clothes, barefoot and penniless, claiming what the world's brightest minds could not. Jonathan's jaw clenched as he studied the boy, torn between irritation and curiosity. Around them the crowd moved on, oblivious to the silent confrontation. His daughter, however, tilted her head and looked at the boy with something Jonathan had long abandoned: hope. "What did you say?" Jonathan asked finally, his voice low, dangerous even. The boy didn't flinch. He lifted his chin and repeated, "I said I can help your daughter walk again." His words were steady, his eyes unwavering, and for a moment Jonathan felt something stir inside him, a flicker of belief that he quickly crushed beneath the weight of his logic. This was nonsense, he told himself, nothing more than a beggar's trick, a desperate ploy for attention or money. Yet something in the boy's eyes unsettled him. They weren't the eyes of a liar. They weren't the eyes of someone seeking pity. They were the eyes of someone who knew something, someone carrying a truth that others couldn't see. Jonathan straightened, placing himself firmly between the boy and his daughter, as though shielding her from false promises. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "You don't know what you're talking about." Jonathan Blake carried the weight of those words long after he had turned away, pushing his daughter's wheelchair toward the building's revolving doors. The boy's gaze lingered on him like a shadow, and though Jonathan tried to dismiss it as foolish nonsense, something inside refused to let go. The words, "You will wonder if you turned away from the one chance she had," echoed in his mind with every step. His daughter looked up at him as they entered the marble-floored lobby, her innocent eyes searching his face for answers he did not have. He had always been the man who knew everything, who had a solution for every problem, but now he felt cornered by the impossible. In the boardroom, he could silence doubts with sheer authority. In his empire, he ruled with certainty. But in this matter of his daughter's legs, he was a man stripped of power, and the voice of a beggar boy threatened to expose that vulnerability. All through the day, as he signed papers, approved projects, and listened to presentations, the boy's words gnawed at him. No deal, no profit, no success could quiet the nagging thought. What if he was telling the truth? That night, when he tucked his daughter into bed, her eyes were still filled with hope. She grasped his hand, her tiny fingers fragile yet full of strength. "Daddy," she whispered, "what if that boy really can help me?" Jonathan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat betraying the storm inside him. He kissed her forehead and whispered, "Sleep, sweetheart," but inside he was crumbling. He lay awake long after she drifted off, staring at the ceiling of his mansion, wondering how a boy with nothing could speak with such certainty. His mind kept returning to those eyes, not desperate, not begging for coins, but steady and knowing, as though the boy had seen something others could not. Finally, unable to bear the torment, Jonathan decided he would return the next morning. He told himself it was not because he believed, but because he needed to silence the voice in his head once and for all. If he confronted the boy again and exposed his words as nothing more than nonsense, then perhaps the ghost of hope haunting him would finally disappear. The next morning, Jonathan's car pulled up to the same street, and there, as though waiting for him, the boy sat on the curb again. The city moved around him, indifferent, but the boy's posture was the same, calm, patient, as if he knew Jonathan would return. Jonathan stepped out, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement, and stood before him. "You," Jonathan said, his tone a mixture of challenge and restraint. "You claim you can do what the world's best doctors cannot. Explain yourself." The boy looked up at him with those same piercing eyes and replied simply, "I can't explain it to you in words you'll believe. But if you let me try, you will see." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He hated riddles, hated uncertainty, and yet the boy's calmness disarmed him. "Why should I trust you?" Jonathan demanded. The boy tilted his head. "Because you've already thought about me all night. If my words were empty, you would have forgotten me. But you couldn't." Jonathan's breath hitched. How did the boy know? His daughter, seated in her wheelchair behind him, leaned forward, her eyes wide with hope. "Daddy, please," she whispered, "just let him try." Jonathan's heart cracked at her plea. He was a man who had never bowed to pressure, yet here he was, caught between the impossible and the hope in his daughter's voice. He exhaled slowly, then gave the boy a warning glare. "One chance," Jonathan said firmly. "If this is some trick, you'll regret it." The boy nodded, not with fear but with quiet acceptance. "I only need one." He asked Jonathan to take his daughter to a quiet place, away from the noise of the city. Against his better judgment, Jonathan agreed, and soon they were in the garden of Jonathan's estate, the air thick with the scent of roses and the distant sound of fountains. The boy knelt before the girl, placing his small hand gently on her knee. He closed his eyes, his face serene as though entering a state of deep concentration. Jonathan watched, skeptical yet unable to look away. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Finally, the boy opened his eyes and spoke softly to Jonathan's daughter. "Stand!" Jonathan almost laughed at the absurdity. Stand? How could she stand when doctors had declared her condition incurable? Yet before he could protest, his daughter's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair. She hesitated, her face pale, but something in the boy's voice gave her courage. Slowly, trembling, she shifted forward. Jonathan's breath caught as he saw her legs, frail and weak, begin to bear weight. With a cry of effort, she pushed herself up. For the first time in years, she stood. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, disbelief crashing over him like a tidal wave. His daughter wobbled, then took a single step, just one, before collapsing back into the chair, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and joy. I stood. Jonathan staggered back, his hands trembling, his mind spinning. It wasn't a full miracle, not yet, but it was something no doctor had ever achieved. One step, one impossible, undeniable step. His eyes darted to the boy, who looked back at him calmly. Jonathan Blake had built his life on the foundation of logic, precision, and power. but nothing about what he had just witnessed aligned with the world he knew. His daughter's trembling legs had held her weight for the first time in years, and though it was only for a brief moment, the image seared itself into his mind like a scar he could never erase. That night, as he sat in his study surrounded by shelves of books, glowing screens and the quiet hum of wealth, he could not focus on numbers or contracts. So instead, his thoughts kept drifting back to the boy, the beggar with ragged clothes, unkempt hair, and eyes that carried something both ancient and ageless. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how could someone with nothing command a power that made the impossible real? Jonathan had once laughed at stories of miracles and healers, dismissing them as foolish superstition, but now his arrogance was cracking. He had seen his daughter stand with his own eyes. He had heard her voice tremble with joy. No empire, no scientific explanation, no amount of money could account for what had happened in his garden. And so Jonathan, the man who trusted no one but himself, was forced to consider the unthinkable, to trust a boy the world had discarded. The next day, Jonathan ordered his driver to find the boy again. Hours passed, the car roaming through alleys and crowded streets, yet the boy was nowhere to be seen. Jonathan's frustration mounted. Was it possible that the boy had disappeared, like some phantom who had appeared only to haunt him? Just as despair began to take root, his daughter tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, he'll come back when it's time." Her faith cut him deeper than any sword. She believed without hesitation, while he wrestled with doubt. That evening, as the sun painted the sky with strokes of orange and violet, Jonathan found the boy waiting outside the gates of his estate, calm as though he had been expected all along. Jonathan confronted him immediately. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice edged with the authority of a man accustomed to answers. But the boy's reply was infuriatingly simple. "Someone who knows how to heal what others cannot." Jonathan pressed further, his anger spilling out. "How? What is your secret? Why should I trust you with my daughter's life?" The boy did not flinch. "Because you've already seen enough to know you cannot walk away. You are not here because you believe me. You are here because you have no choice but to hope." That night, Jonathan allowed the boy to work again. In the quiet of the mansion's grand hall, the boy placed his hands gently upon the girl's legs, whispering words in a language Jonathan could not recognize. There was no flash of light, no dramatic spectacle, only the steady rhythm of breath, the quiet intensity of belief, and the sense that something unseen was moving between them. Minutes stretched into hours, and though Jonathan could not comprehend what he was witnessing, his daughter's body seemed to respond. Her legs twitched, her toes curled, her muscles, once lifeless, flickered with signs of awakening. Jonathan's eyes widened, his skepticism warring with awe. He wanted to demand proof, to call in scientists and doctors, but a strange stillness silenced him. For the first time in his life, he simply watched in humility, realizing that power was not always loud, not always adorned with gold, but sometimes found in silence and simplicity. When the session ended, the boy looked at him with quiet intensity. "She is healing, but it will take time. You must not let your doubt poison her hope." Jonathan clenched his fists, frustrated by the lack of control, yet he nodded. His daughter smiled at him that night, as though she were already whole again, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt the weight of hope pressing on his chest. But hope came with a price. News began to spread among the mansion staff that something strange was happening. Whispers carried into the city, and soon Jonathan found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Journalists prowled outside the gates, hungry for a story, while skeptics and so-called experts flooded him with warnings. "This is fraud," they said. "Some trick. Don't let this boy play with your emotions." Even his business associates mocked him behind closed doors, questioning whether the once ruthless Jonathan Blake had finally lost his edge. Yet none of their words mattered when he looked at his daughter's face, her cheeks flushed with life, her eyes glowing with the possibility of freedom. She was changing before his eyes, and no ridicule, no scorn could erase the truth he had seen. Still, Jonathan's pride was not easily silenced. The weeks melted into a rhythm Jonathan had never imagined himself living. Each evening, after the chaos of boardrooms and phone calls, he would return home not to study numbers or negotiate deals, but to sit quietly in a dimly lit hall while a boy in tattered clothes worked over his daughter with hands that glowed, not with light, but with purpose. And every evening, his daughter grew stronger, walking with steadier steps, laughing with a voice unbroken by pain, even daring to run short distances across the marble floors of the mansion. Yet the more progress she made, the heavier Jonathan's heart grew, because beneath the miracle lingered a mystery he could no longer ignore. Who was this boy really, and what had shaped him into someone who could command such power? The world Jonathan knew demanded explanations. Every deal had terms, every contract had clauses, every success had a strategy. But the boy offered no explanations, only results. That silence gnawed at Jonathan, until one night, after his daughter had gone to sleep, he confronted the boy directly. "I need to know the truth," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "Where do you come from? How did you get this gift?" "I cannot entrust my daughter's future to a mystery I do not understand." The boy paused, studying Jonathan as though weighing whether he was worthy of an answer, and then he spoke in a tone so quiet it forced Jonathan to lean forward. "You want to know my story? Then you must be prepared to carry it, because it is heavier than you think." And so, for the first time, the boy began to unravel the tale of his life. He had not always been a beggar. Once he too had been a child with dreams, running barefoot through dusty streets, his laughter echoing through alleys. His mother, a seamstress, had believed fiercely in education, teaching him to read by candlelight with books salvaged from garbage bins. His father had died young, leaving them with little but love and survival instincts. Yet in that poverty, the boy had discovered languages. He had a mind that absorbed words like rain into dry earth. By the time he was 10, he could speak 5 tongues fluently, picked up from market stalls and travelers. But what caught the world's attention wasn't his ability to speak. It was his ability to heal. One night his mother fell gravely ill. With no doctors willing to treat someone who couldn't pay, the boy had done the only thing he could. He sat by her side, whispering prayers, pressing his hands to her chest, begging for her life to be spared. And in the dark silence she began to breathe easier. By dawn she was sitting up, the fever broken. Word spread, and soon neighbors came to him with their wounds and ailments. Some left healed, some didn't, but all spoke of a boy who carried something unexplainable within him. That gift, however, was not welcomed by everyone. Authorities accused him of fraud, charlatans tried to exploit him, and when his mother died years later, he had no protector left. By 15, he was on the streets, stripped of everything but his strange gift and the scars it brought. "That is why I am here," he finished, his voice steady but tired. "Not because I chose this life, but because it was chosen for me." Jonathan sat in stunned silence, the weight of the boy's words pressing against him. For a man who had built his empire on contracts and power, the boy's story was like a mirror he didn't want to face. Here was someone who had nothing, no wealth, no titles, no shield of influence, yet who carried within him a strength Jonathan could not buy at any price. His instinct was to dismiss it, to rationalize it as coincidence or exaggeration. But then he remembered his daughter's trembling first steps, her radiant smile, the laughter he thought he would never hear again. Coincidence could not explain those things. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt small, not because he was powerless, but because he realized he had never truly understood what power was. Yet even as he began to accept the boy's story, a storm was brewing outside. News of the miracle had spread beyond whispers and tabloids. The media descended upon Jonathan's mansion, demanding answers. Religious leaders called it blasphemy. Doctors called it pseudoscience. Business partners whispered about Jonathan's judgment, some even suggesting he was being manipulated. One evening, as Jonathan left a shareholder meeting, a reporter thrust a microphone in his face. "Mr. Blake, is it true you've hired a beggar boy to heal your daughter? Do you believe in miracles now?" Jonathan froze, his instincts screaming to deny everything to protect his reputation. But when he opened his mouth, the only words that came out were, "I believe in what I've..." The storm that had been gathering finally broke, not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet weight of inevitability. The boy's presence could no longer be hidden, and Jonathan's mansion had become a fortress under siege by cameras, microphones, and endless questions. Inside, however, a different battle was being fought. A battle not of image or reputation, but of truth. Jonathan's daughter, once bound to a chair, now walked freely through the halls, her laughter echoing like music he thought he'd never hear again. Each step she took was both a miracle and a rebuke to the skepticism outside his gates. Yet Jonathan knew miracles alone could not silence the world. Only courage could. On a cold morning, after a night without sleep, Jonathan made a decision that would alter his life forever. He called for a press conference. Reporters flooded into the grand hall, their cameras hungry, their pens sharp, ready to tear apart whatever words he dared to speak. The boy stood quietly in the corner, his clothes still simple, his posture unassuming, while Jonathan took the podium. For a man who had spent decades mastering speeches designed to impress investors, his voice trembled at first, not with fear, but with the weight of honesty. "You want the truth?" he began, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "The truth is, my daughter was dying, not in body but in spirit. She had been told she would never walk again. And then came someone the world would overlook, someone you might pass on the street without seeing. He gave her back what money and medicine could not. You can call it luck, you can call it fraud, you can call it whatever you like. But I call it a miracle, and I will not deny it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some scoffing, some stunned into silence, but Jonathan pressed on. "All my life I believed power was measured in wealth, in control, in influence. But I was wrong. True power lies not in what you own, but in what you give. And this boy whom the world called worthless, has given me more than all the money I have ever made." The room fell still, his words cutting deeper than any headline ever could. The boy, however, was not basking in glory. When the conference ended, and Jonathan's daughter clung proudly to her father's side, he slipped away to the garden, sitting beneath the old oak tree that shaded the estate. Jonathan found him there, gazing at the sky as though searching for something beyond the reach of words. "You don't like the attention, do you?" Jonathan asked softly. The boy shook his head. "Miracles were never meant to be spectacles," he said. "They are whispers, not shouts. The louder the world gets, the less people hear what truly matters." Jonathan sat beside him, humbled by the wisdom spoken in such a gentle tone. "Then what do we do?" he asked. "The world won't stop watching." The boy turned, his eyes carrying the weight of years far beyond his age. "You live as though no one is watching. Teach her." He gestured toward Jonathan's daughter playing in the distance. "That the gift she's been given isn't just her legs, but the chance to walk with purpose." Jonathan's throat tightened. For the first time in his life, he realized that money could build walls, buy loyalty, silence critics, but it could not purchase meaning. Meaning was found only in giving, in humility, in love. Days turned into weeks, and though the noise outside never fully faded, inside the Blake household something new blossomed. Peace. His daughter's recovery became more than just her story. It became her mission. With the boy's encouragement, she began writing about her journey, not to boast, but to inspire other children who had been told, "You can't." Jonathan watched in awe as his little girl, once fragile, now stood tall before groups of students, telling them not just about healing, but
morning comes, but it no longer feels like morning. The sun, if it can even be called that in this smog-choked hive, struggles to pierce the industrial haze. The streets are loud again, workers shouting, machines grinding, the constant roar of a city enslaved to production quotas. To everyone else, life is the same endless monotony, but to him, nothing feels the same anymore. When he opens his eyes, he hears the whispers still, faint but persistent, like echoes beneath the skin. They tell him where to go, what to notice, what to ignore. They tug at his thoughts when he speaks to his co-workers, when he reports to his overseer, when he stands in the endless queues for his ration of recaf and nutrient paste. At first he tries to resist. He tells himself it was a dream, a hallucination born of exhaustion and desperation. But the burn mark on his hand, the jagged scar in the shape of the 8-pointed starry, minds him it was no dream. It is a mark, a brand etched into his very flesh. And as the days pass, the whispers grow harder to ignore. One evening, he finds himself back at the shrine, though he doesn't remember walking there. The candles have been replaced, fresh blood stains the stone, and the symbol carved into the wall glows faintly in the dark. He kneels again, without hesitation. The words pour from him easier this time, smoother. More confident, the whispers reward him. He feels it, a surge of energy coursing through his veins. An unnatural warmth that makes his skin crawl. His senses sharpen. He can hear the rats scurrying in the pipes, the distant hiss of steam 3 levels down, the faint heartbeat of the man kneeling beside him in the shadows. Yes, he is not alone. There are others here, workers like him. Their faces are gaunt, their eyes wide and glassy, their hands clutching at scraps of parchment and trinkets twisted into crude talismans. They mutter the same words he does, their voices blending into a low chant that grows into a rising hum. Then a deafening roar. Together they pray not to the Emperor, but to something older, darker, infinite. The air grows thick. The shadows writhe. And for the briefest instant, he sees them towering shapes beyond the veil. Monstrous forms, shifting and laughing in colors his mind cannot fully comprehend. The warp stares back at him, and he does not flinch. When it ends, the others scatter, vanishing into the alleys like vermin. But he stays, trembling, exhilarated. His reflection in a puddle catches his eye, and he freezes. His eyes, they are not the same dot where once they were dull and lifeless from years of labor. Now they gleam faintly, a glow like embers smoldering beneath the surface. He blinks, and it vanishes, but the truth remains. He is changing, back in his habsal. He hides his hands from the overseers. He speaks less to his fellow workers. His laughter, once hollow, now carries an edge. He dreams of fire and blood, of chains snapping, of the Emperor's throne crumbling to dust. He dreams of leading, of standing above the masses who once ignored him, with the mark of chaos blazing proudly across his chest. But the dreams do not always empower. Sometimes he wakes screaming, drenched in sweat, his body convulsing as though unseen claws tear through his flesh. His bones ache, his muscles twitch. His reflection grins at him when he does not. The man he once was is fracturing. A new being is clawing its way out, piece by piece, through his prayers, his rituals, his surrender, and deep down, he knows he cannot stop it anymore. The whispers no longer ask. They command, and he obeys. The hive city never sleeps, but its shadows hide more than the Imperium dares to admit. He walks among the crowds like a ghost, quieter, sharper, different. No one notices the faint glow in his eyes, or the way his breath frosts even in the smog-choked warmth. No one dares to look too closely, until one man does. It is his overseer bloated with authority, fat from skimming rations while the workers starve. For years, this man spat orders at him, mocked him, beat him when quotas fell short. A reminder that he was nothing, that he would always be nothing. But not tonight. The shift ends late. The overseer corners him in a maintenance tunnel, drunk on recaf laced with contraband. His laughter echoes down the corridor as he raises his shock baton. Daring to strike, something snaps. The whispers swell like a chorus in his skull. Take him, and before he realizes it, his hand is raised not in defense, but in wrath. The air warps. Sparks leap from the broken lights above. The overseer freezes, baton clattering to the ground as his body locks in place. His eyes bulge, his lips tremble, but he cannot move. The worker steps closer, trembling not with fear, but exhilaration. Power surges through his veins like fire, licking at his nerves, urging him forward. His hand tightens, invisible claws gripping the man's throat. The overseer gags. His feet leave the ground. For the first time, he sees terror in those cruel eyes. For the first time, he is the master. The whispers laugh, 1,000 voices exalting his strength. His heart pounds like a war drum, faster, harder, until it feels as though it will burst. Blood vessels swell across his temples, his teeth ache. His vision blurs, but he cannot stop. With a sickening crack, the overseer's neck twists. His body falls like a sack of meat, eyes wide, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Silence, the worker gasps, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. He stares at his hands, trembling, bloodless yet drenched in murder. He should feel horror, he should feel guilt, but all he feels is release. The years of humiliation, the endless drudgery, the hopelessness all washed away in an instant of violence. He is no longer the prey. He is the predator, and yet he is not alone. From the shadows of the tunnel, figures step forward. Not patrolmen, not workers. Others like him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, bearing the faint marks of the warp's touch. They saw, they approve. One of them kneels, pressing a hand to the corpse. The gods are pleased, he whispers. Another claps the worker on the shoulder. Tonight you are reborn. The whispers echo their words. Louder now, clearer. No longer background noise, but a symphony calling him forward. He does not resist. He walks away from the corpse with them, his hands still trembling, his pulse still racing. He does not look back. By the time the body is found, the worker is already gone, disappeared into the maze of alleys and abandoned shrines where the Emperor's light does not reach. He spilled his first blood. The path is set. There is no turning back. The corpse of the overseer had barely cooled before the whispers guided him into the underhiv's deepest veins. The alleys turned narrower, the air thick with rot and fumes. He felt the shadows shifting as though they welcomed him. He was no longer wandering. He was being led. The cultists, his new companions, spoke little. Their eyes glimmered faintly in the gloom, their footsteps unnaturally soft. They moved with purpose, weaving through tunnels, climbing broken stairwells, descending into cracks where no sane man would tread. At last, they came to a cavern. Once it had been a maintenance hub, now long abandoned. The walls were slick with condensation, the floor littered with broken tools and shattered pipes. But the centerpiece was unmistakable, a great circle carved into the concrete, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift under his gaze. Candles burned with black flame, casting the chamber into a nightmare glow. He felt his knees weaken. This was no shrine of the Emperor. This was older, fouler. This was the domain of the warp. The cultists formed a circle around him, their chants low, guttural, alien. Each voice layered upon the next, building into a suffocating wave of sound that made his heart stutter. One of them stepped. Forward, a figure taller than the rest, cloaked in tattered robes of crimson and black. His face was hidden beneath a mask of bone carved into a snarling beast, its eyes burning with faint warp fire. When he spoke, the sound seemed to echo from everywhere at once. You have shed blood in the god's name. The first step is taken. The worker trembled, his scarred hand clutching his chest. I did not mean the masked one cut him off. You did. You wanted, and the gods answered. The whispers in his skull roared in agreement. The cultists dragged the overseer's corpse into the circle. They laid it upon the cracked floor, arranging it like an offering. Blood still leaked from the twisted neck, seeping into the etched runes. The lines pulsed, drinking it in, glowing faintly with sickly light. The masked figure produced a dagger relic of twisted metal that seemed alive, its blade shifting like liquid fire. He placed it in the worker's hand. "Kneel," the worker obeyed. "Speak their names." And though he did not know the words, his mouth moved, forming syllables that scraped his throat raw. He spoke of the gods, the blood god, the changer of ways, the lord of decay, the prince of excess. The four pillars of chaos, each name burned like a brand against his soul. The masked one nodded. "Now bleed for them." The worker pressed the blade to his palm. The steel was hot, searing into his flesh as he drew it across his hand. Blood spilled onto the floor, hissing as it touched the glowing circle. The cavern shook. The candles flared. The whispers screamed in triumph. Pain ripped through his body. His vision blurred. His ears rang. He saw things, worlds burning, gods laughing, chains breaking, oceans of blood, storms of rot, endless madness. He saw himself among them not as a worker, not as a victim, but as a champion. The cultists fell to their knees. The masked figure raised his arms. "The gods accept you." The worker gasped, clutching his chest, his body convulsing as the warp surged within him. He collapsed onto the floor, writhing as though aflame. His skin blistered, his blood boiled, his mind fractured into 1,000 shards, and then silence. He rose slowly, panting, drenched in sweat and blood. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, brighter than before. The whispers no longer pressed against him, they sang. The masked one bowed his head. "From this night forward, you are brother. From this night, you are chosen." The cultists echoed the chant, their voices rising in frenzied devotion. Chosen, chosen, chosen. And in that moment, the worker knew he was no longer a man. He was a servant of chaos. The void was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't absence, but presence like the breath of something watching, waiting, lurking just beyond perception. Aboard the battered Imperial cruiser Gloria Invictus, the crew huddled in corridors dimly lit by failing lumen strips. The warp voyage had dragged into its 12th day, and already the signs of unraveling were spreading like a contagion. At first, it was small things, crewmen muttering prayers under their breath longer than usual, agencies lingering in the darkened machine rooms, tracing unholy runes with grease-stained fingers as though guided by invisible hands. The astropath refusing to eat, staring into nothing with hollow eyes, whispering to voices only she could hear. But now the symptoms were louder. Fights breaking out in the mess hall over ration packs that weren't missing. Bulkhead doors rattling as if struck from the other side when no one was there. Entire gun deck squads swearing they heard scratching on the hull, though sensors reported nothing but the empty void. The whispers were growing, crawling into every corner of the ship. Captain Darius Kane, scarred veteran of Cadia's last offense, stood in his quarters, clutching a tattered Imperial creed book in one hand and his bolt pistol in the other. He had seen chaos before he had watched demons walk through firestorms, and Astartes fight like demigods against nightmares given form. But here, aboard his ship, in the quiet of the warp, the enemy wasn't an army. It was an infection of the soul. The Gloria Invictus had received a distress signal days before entering the Imperium, a fragmentary Vox transmission from an Imperial colony on the edge of the segmentum obscure. The words had been drowned in static, But the message was clear. Enough chaos was there, and the Imperium needed aid. Darius swore to answer, but the warp was never merciful, and now his crew was breaking long before the ship reached its destination. He walked the corridors, past trembling men and silent servitors, his officer's cloak dragging across stained metal. The whispers grew louder as he neared the chapel. It was packed, hundreds of crew kneeling before the Aquila, their eyes glazed, their lips moving in broken chants. But it wasn't the Emperor's name they were speaking. Blood, fire, freedom. The voices rose, uncoordinated but united in intent. Darius gritted his teeth. He raised his voice, a soldier's roar cutting through the muttering. Stand firm. You are servants of the Emperor, not slaves to lies. For a moment, silence fell. A fragile, brittle silence. And then a crewman lifted his head. His eyes were pitch black, his veins crawling with red light beneath pale skin. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice. The Emperor cannot protect them here, Captain. The warp is ours. Their souls are already promised. The man collapsed, twitching, before bursting apart like rotten fruit. His blood forming shapes on the floor, shapes that looked disturbingly like 8-pointed stars. The chapel erupted. Some fled, some screamed, some fell to their knees and began clawing at their own flesh. Darius fired his bolt pistol, cutting down 3 men already foaming at the mouth, their bodies writhing with possession. And in the heart of it all, the whispers grew into laughter hours later. The ship's log recorded whole decks sealed off. The captain's orders were clear. Anyone showing signs of corruption was to be executed, no matter rank or service. Whole families. The hull groaned as the warp pressed tighter, like a predator circling prey too weak to resist. The astropath screamed in her chamber, blind eyes bleeding as she chanted the same words over and over. They are coming. They are here. They will never leave. And she was right. Outside the warp currents, a shadow began to form. Not of metal or stone, but of pure malice. A warship, but alive, its hull writhing with flesh and steel fused together. A Chaos Raider. The Predator had arrived. Captain Darius stood on the bridge, jaw clenched, bolt pistol still holstered at his side. He looked at the screens, at the looming silhouette of the enemy, and knew the truth. The whispers weren't the beginning. They were the invitation, and now chaos had answered. The first impact came like a thunderclap. The Gloria Invictus shook violently as the Chaos Raider slammed through the warp currents, its twisted hull crackling with sickly light. On the bridge, officers scrambled to keep balance while alarms screamed through the voxnet. Warning runes flared red across Auspex displays. Each one a reminder that the nightmare outside wasn't just a vision, it was real. And it was hungry. Captain Darius Kane gripped the command lectern, his scarred knuckles white. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and burning oil. Helm, evasive pattern, Gamma. He barked. Negative, Captain, cried the helmsman, sweat dripping down his temple. Warp currents binding a sour trajectory is locked. Then fight her free. Kane snapped. Or we die here. But before the order could be carried out, the hull reverberated with a deeper sounder claw, not metal, raking against the cruiser's flank. The Chaos ship wasn't firing lances or torpedoes. It was latching on. Contact, reported the sensor officer, voice trembling. Enemy vessel is attaching boarding tendrils. Breach points forming across decks 40 to 60. Emperor, preserve us. Cain drew his bolt pistol, the weapon's weight a grim comfort. Sound general quarters, ready every man and woman to repel borders. No one yields, no one breaks. The corridors of the Gloria Invictus became battlegrounds, boarding claws, alive with writhing sinew and steel, punched through the bulkheads, spewing out figures in spiked armor and reeking of blood. Chaos Marines, warriors of the dark gods, towering over mortal soldiers, their bolters roaring death in every corridor. Imperial crewmen fought with desperation, loss fire hissing in the dark. Dozens fell, shredded by explosive bolts or torn apart by yet still they fought, forming barricades from overturned crates and the bodies of their comrades. The cries of the dying mixed with the guttural chants of the invaders, creating a symphony of carnage that echoed through every deck in the engine halls. A squad of tech priests was slaughtered before their sacred machines, their metallic prayers drowned out by the roar of demonic laughter. In the Medicae Bay, nurses turned their scalpels into weapons, stabbing frantically at warriors whose armor made the strikes little more than irritations. Even the children born aboard the ship were herded into sealed compartments, their terrified sobs muffled by the groan of the hull. Chaos had come aboard, and the Gloria Invictus bled. Guard Cain himself led the defense in the forward hangar. The great void bay was already half destroyed, its void shields flickering as boarding pods punctured the walls. He fired his bolt pistol again and again, each shot claiming a corrupted soldier or mutant. Around him, the ship's armsmen unleashed disciplined volleys, their lasguns painting the darkness with red lances. But then the real horror strode through the breach. A Chaos Space Marine, clad in Baroque armor of crimson and brass, his helm adorned with horns, his chain axe dripping gore. He moved like a predator, carving through Cain's men as if they were nothing but parchment. Blood sprayed across the hangar deck, staining the Aquila banners that still hung defiantly. Cain's voxbead crackled. "Captain," came the voice of his first officer, strained and ragged. "We cannot hold them. They are too strong." Cain fired a bolt round into a mutant, charging him, its head bursting like a melon. "Then we bleed them until the Emperor takes us. Hold every corridor. Make them pay for every step." Elsewhere, the whispers still plagued the crew. Some dropped their weapons entirely, kneeling before the Chaos Marines as if greeting gods. They were cut down just the same. Their corpses used to decorate the boarding lanes. Others turned their lasguns on their comrades, corrupted by promises whispered straight into their skulls. The Gloria Invictus was at war with itself as much as the invaders, yet amid the slaughter, there were sparks of defiance. A squad of armsmen detonated charges in a breach point, collapsing a bulkhead and burying half a dozen Chaos Marines in tons of metal. A lone sister of battle, stranded aboard the ship during transport, wielded her flamer with holy fury, her hymns of vengeance ringing even as her armor was torn apart by bolter fire. The ship was dying, but its spirit had not yet broken. Cain reached the hangar's command, Deus, his bolt pistol empty. He drew his power sword, the blade humming with a blue field. The Chaos Marine with the chain axe turned toward him, snarling a laugh through vox distortion. "You smell of Cadia," the traitor growled. "I remember that world. How it burned. How your kin screamed as we tore their fortress down." Cain's jaw clenched, rage burning hotter than fear. "Then remember this," he spat, raising his blade. Cadia stood until the last man. "And so will I." The two warriors clashed, sparks flying as power field met demon-forged steel. The battle around them seemed to fade, every eye drawn to the duel, the defiance of the Imperium against the might of chaos. Embodied in two figures locked in mortal combat, Cain parried, barely keeping up with the brute strength of the traitor. Each strike sent shocks through his bones, but he refused to fall. With every ounce of will, he pushed back, his blade a shining beacon in the darkness. The duel raged on, neither side yielding, and though Cain knew he might not live to see another sunrise, he fought with the knowledge that his defiance was not just his own, it was the defiance of mankind itself. The ship burned, the decks ran with blood, and in the warp outside, more shadows stirred. The boarding had only begun. The chain axe roared like a predator, its teeth grinding and spitting sparks as it slammed against Cain's power sword. The impact rattled his bones, nearly tearing the weapon from his grip. The Chaos Marine was stronger and humanly so. Each swing was a hammer blow, meant not to duel but to annihilate. Captain Cain gritted his teeth, refusing to yield. His blade hummed with a power field, slicing arcs of blue light through the smoke. The hangar was chaos, incarnate bolt of fire, lost blasts, screams, and the clash of steel. Yet in the heart of it all, it felt as though time had narrowed to just two combatants, one mortal, one monster. The traitor's laughter rang out, distorted through his vox grill. You fight well, for prey, but the dark gods demand blood, and yours will paint their altar. Cain lunged, stabbing at the traitor's joint. The blade glanced off twisted ceramite, leaving only a scorched groove. The Chaos Marine retaliated with a downward chop so fierce that Cain barely rolled aside in time. The axe shattered the deck plating where he had stood, metal shrieking under the force. Emperor, guide me, Cain muttered under his breath, rising to his feet. His men were dying around him. The Chaos Marines pressed the hangar defenses relentlessly, their crimson and brass armor reflecting the flames. Cain couldn't let despair take root, not now. The traitor tilted his helm, regarding Cain as though savoring his defiance. You cling to your corpse god's name as if it shields you. Let me show you what true power feels like. And then the air changed. The hangar lights flickered. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as though the void itself pressed down on every soul. A shadow unfurled behind the Chaos Marine, vast and writhing. Warp energy seeped into reality, shimmering like heat haze, twisting banners and warping steel. The smell of rot and copper filled every lung. Cain's breath caught. It wasn't just a warrior before him, it was a champion. A vessel of chaos. The traitor's armor seemed to breathe, runes along its plates glowing faintly red. His chain axe crackled with baleful fire, each tooth wreathed in unnatural flame. Do you feel it, little man? The traitor hissed, his voice deeper now, resonant with something far beyond his own throat. The blessings of Khorne flow through me. I am not merely a warrior. I am chosen. Around them, the invaders howled in frenzy. Mutants clawed at their own flesh, offering blood to the warp. Traitor Marines slammed fists against armor in unholy rhythm, chanting praises to the blood god. Even the air vibrated with their madness. Cain's heart pounded. He had seen war, but never a man elevated to something half demon, half god. Fear clawed at him, whispering to yield, to kneel, to beg for mercy. But Cain crushed the thought. If this was a god's champion, then he would meet him with the Emperor's will. The duel resumed, fiercer than before. Cain's blade sparked wildly against the axe, his arms screaming from the strain. He fought with precision, Every strike aimed at a weak point, but the traitor's strength was overwhelming. Each clash drove him back, step by step, toward the burning wreckage of a transport shuttle. "You are already dead," the Chaos Marine snarled, pressing down with brute force. Kane locked his blade against the axe, their faces inches apart. Behind the demon-helmed mask, Kane could see eyes glowing like embers. "Then let's see," Kane growled, spittle flying from his lips, "how long it takes me to kill a dead man." With a roar, he twisted aside, shoving the traitor off balance. Sparks flew as Kane slashed, scoring a deeper cut across the Marine's thigh. It wasn't enough to cripple, but it drew black, steaming ichor. For the first time, the traitor staggered. A ripple spread across the battlefield. Imperial soldiers, cheering, emboldened by their captain's defiance. The Chaos Marines answered with guttural bellows, redoubling their slaughter. The hangar was a storm of fire and blood. The traitor only laughed. "Yes, bleed me. Each drop is an offering. Khorne will feast upon this duel." Elsewhere in the hangar, Kane's Voxbead crackled with desperate reports. "Captain, bulkheads are falling. Decks 51 through 53 are lost. Civilians massacred. We can't hold." The voice cut off in static, replaced by a wet, choking scream. Kane forced himself to focus. If the champion lived, the ship was lost. This duel was more than personal, it was the fulcrum upon which the fate of Gloria Invictus turned. The Chaos Marine raised his axe high, WARP fire crackling along the blade. Kane steadied his power sword, whispering one final prayer to the Emperor. The two combatants surged forward again, their clash echoing like thunder across the dying hangar. As they fought, the warp shadow loomed higher, a vision of endless skulls piled upon each other, rivers of blood spilling into infinity. Kane blinked, and for a heartbeat he was not in the hangar, but on a battlefield of bones stretching to the horizon. He felt the gaze of something vast, something hungry, watching the duel with anticipation. The champion of chaos fought not just for victory, but for spectacle. For the amusement of a god, Kane roared and struck again, his blade flaring brighter, driven by sheer will. His defiance was not just for himself. Fit was for the Imperium, for the nameless billions who would never even know his name. And though his arms shook, though his blood ran from wounds he could no longer count, Kane stood unbroken. The duel was not finished, but the gods were watching. The hangar screamed as though alive. Metal groaned under impossible strain. Hull plates warped and bent inward, and sparks rained like falling stars. The Gloria Invictus was dying not just from battle damage, but from something deeper, something wrong. Warp energy seeped through every seam of the vessel, saturating the ship's spirit with corruption. Captain Kane's duel raged on amid the chaos. His power sword clashed against the demon-charged chain axe, each strike resounding like a bell tolling doom. The Chaos Champion's strength was unrelenting, yet Kane still stood, his uniform scorched, his body bleeding, his spirit unbroken. Around them, the last remnants of the crew fought tooth and nail. Lost fire lanced across the hangar, desperate men and women firing until their weapons overheated, hands blistered, throats hoarse from screaming battle cries. Some were cut down instantly by bolter fire. Others were torn apart by claws and blades. But all held the line, knowing retreat meant death anyway. Kane parried another strike, his sword shuddering against the weight of the chain axe. The traitor's voice boomed, layered with something more than human. "Do you feel it, mortal? Your ship bleeds. Its machine spirit weeps. Soon it will be ours. Your resistance is but a whisper in the storm. Cain shoved back with all his might, forcing the Chaos Marine a step away. His voice was hoarse but steady. If this ship dies, it dies Imperial, never yours. Elsewhere, decks crumbled under the pressure of the warp's intrusion. Bulkheads bent as if melted, corridors stretched longer than they should, and screams echoed from places that no longer existed on the ship's maps. Crew members reported shadows moving against the lights, whispers luring them into doors that led to nowhere. The Medicae Bay became a slaughterhouse, walls pulsing as though breathing. The shrieks of the wounded mingled with the unholy laughter of things that had never been human. The Gellerfield, already strained, flickered dangerously. The Gloria Invictus wasn't just under attack. It was becoming part of the warp. Back in the hangar, Cain's strength faltered. He was no space marine, only a man of flesh and bone. His parries grew slower, his breathing ragged, his vision blurred with sweat and blood. The Chaos Champion pressed forward like an avalanche, each strike shaking Cain to his core. The traitor slammed his axe into the deck, sparks flying. Your courage is wasted. Khorne does not care for courage. He cares for blood, and yours runs thin. Cain stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. His sword hummed weakly, its power field flickering. He raised it again with trembling hands. But then he heard it. A chant, not the guttural howls of the traitors, but something pure. His surviving crew, scattered across the hangar, had begun to shout together a single phrase over and over for the Emperor. It was ragged, desperate, but it was a spark of defiance. Cain steadied himself. His back straightened. His eyes locked onto the traitor's burning gaze. "Then take my blood," he whispered, "but it will be given for him, not for you." The Chaos Champion lunged, axe swinging in a great arc. Cain sidestepped at the last second, driving his power sword into the Marine's side, just beneath the arm. The blade bit deep, cutting through corrupted ceramite and into flesh. The traitor roared, stumbling back, ichor spraying in a black mist. The hangar erupted in cheers. Even as they died, the crew felt hope flare. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible, but the warp's shadow loomed larger. From the bleeding wound, tendrils of smoke-like energy curled upward, coiling around the Marine's body. The traitor's voice deepened, inhuman now, a growl laced with the echoes of countless screaming souls. His armor shifted, horns lengthening, claws sprouting. His wound did not weaken him. It transformed him. Cain's stomach turned. The duel was no longer against a warrior. It was against something far worse. The ship itself joined the chaos. Lights flickered out, plunging decks into darkness. Void shields cracked and faltered. Explosions rippled through the starboard side as fuel lines ruptured. The Gloria Invictus shuddered violently, throwing friend and foe alike to the ground. In the hangar, the warp distortion grew. The floor bubbled, metal liquefying into rivers of molten steel. Figures crawled out of the walls, half-formed demons of smoke and teeth, lashing at the living. Crewmen screamed as they were dragged into fissures opening beneath their feet. Cain rose again, sword in hand, sweat dripping into his eyes. His men were being slaughtered, his ship consumed, and his enemy reborn into monstrosity. And yet he refused to surrender. The Chaos Champion, now twice his size, raised the chain axe. "This ship is ours. Your soul is mine." Cain lifted his sword. His voice carried across the hangar, cutting through the screams and the thunder. "We are not yours. We never will be. We belong to the Emperor." He charged. The clash was apocalyptic. Sparks and blood filled the air, drowned in warp light. Kane's sword struck again and again, each blow weaker but more desperate. The Chaos Champion struck back with fury, his weapon tearing apart the deck like paper. Men and women died around them, the hangar a graveyard of flame. But in the middle of it all, Kane fought like a man already dead, burning his last strength in defiance. As the war pressed in, as the ship shuddered and groaned, as the champion roared his gods, name Captain Darius Kane refused to fall. Not yet. The Gloria Invictus was breaking apart. Its fate now rested on whether one mortal could defy a god's chosen long enough for hope to mean anything at all. The deeper one peers into the abyss of chaos, the clearer it becomes that it is not only an enemy that attacks from the outside, but a parasite that binds itself to the soul. For humanity in Warhammer 40K, the most terrifying reality is not the bolt gun of a Chaos Marine or the sorcery of a demon, but the quiet whisper of corruption that can enslave entire civilizations without a single shot fired. This is the chains of damnation, the slow, inexorable process by which mortals are lured, deceived, and shackled until freedom itself becomes a forgotten dream. Chaos does not simply conquer by force. It conquers by reshaping desire. For the farmer on a backwater agri-world, the promise of better harvests might be enough to let a dark sigil slip into the soil. For the bureaucrat, the lure of power in a hive city filled with corruption might make a prayer to a forbidden god seem like a small price to pay. For a soldier bleeding out on the battlefield, the whisper that promises survival, if only he swears allegiance, can mean the difference between resisting and kneeling. Every soul has a weakness, and chaos thrives in these fractures. What makes these chains unique is their invisibility at first. A man may believe he is acting in his own best interest. A governor might rationalize a pact with the warp as necessary to keep his people alive. A scholar might think a demon-bound tome is simply a useful tool for knowledge. But over time, these choices calcify, and the mortal finds themselves bound tighter and tighter, until every act of rebellion against chaos feels like tearing out their own flesh. The gods demand not only obedience, but dependence, so that even the thought of freedom seems impossible. Consider the story of Seraphes Prime, a planet once loyal to the Imperium. It began with whispers of food shortages. Merchants in the underhives claimed they could bless the crops through rituals, and soon the once starving people enjoyed bountiful harvests. The governor, desperate to stabilize his rule, encouraged these practices, never asking where the power came from. Within decades, the entire world was feeding on the fruits of chaos's generosity. When the Inquisition finally uncovered the truth, Seraphes Prime had already been remade into a demon world, and its population no longer thought of themselves as human at all. The chains were not physical, they were cultural, spiritual, psychological. An entire species can be enslaved without a single iron shackle being forged. The tragedy of these worlds is that they often welcome their damnation, seeing chaos not as a curse but as a gift. The cruelest joke is that, once ensnared, even those who regret their choices cannot break free. Their bodies twist, their minds warp, and their very souls are rewritten in the image of the gods they once bargained with. This is why the Imperium's fanaticism, though brutal, has a grim necessity. To even allow a whisper of chaos into the heart of humanity risks spreading a contagion that can topple entire sectors. To the average imperial citizen, such measures seem cruel burning libraries, censoring knowledge and slaughtering innocents suspected of heresy. But the alternative is worse: the slow corrosion of mankind's will, until nothing remains but thralls to demons. The Imperium, in its endless paranoia, understands that the chains of damnation are far harder to break than they are to prevent. For the average human, the real horror lies not in being slain by a Chaos Marine, but in becoming a puppet to chaos without ever realizing it. Imagine waking one day to discover that every decision you've made for years has not been your own. Imagine finding that your loyalty, your love, even your ambition, were never yours, but gifts planted by a god that now demands repayment. That is the true price of chaos. Does not merely take lives, it consumes choice. And yet, despite all warnings, humanity remains vulnerable. Why? Because to be human is to desire, to fear, to hope, and chaos thrives in these gaps. For every shrine world that resists temptation, there is a mining colony begging for relief, a hive city drowning in despair, a soldier staring at death and wishing for just one more breath. The chains of damnation are forged not by force but by bargains. Humanity signs its own death warrant with ink made from desperation. In the grand scheme, chaos may never need to conquer terror with a fleet or burn the Imperium's armies to ash. All it must do is keep weaving its chains, one governor, one soldier, one farmer at a time until mankind kneels willingly. And when that day comes, the question will not be whether humanity survives, but whether it even remembers what survival was meant to be. When chaos wages war, it does not always march with legions or summon demons to blot out the sky. Sometimes the battlefield is invisible to mind, the heart, and the spirit of a single human being. This is the siege of the soul, the quiet war where chaos wears down its victims until resistance feels not only futile, but meaningless. Humanity's tragedy lies not just in the physical destruction of worlds, but in the conquest of individuals who never realized they were under attack. The Imperium often describes chaos as an external force, a tide of nightmares, a storm from the warp. But for those who live through its touch, chaos feels intimate. It begins with a whisper at the edge of thought, a flicker in the corner of the eye, a dream that feels too vivid to dismiss. A lonely soldier might hear the voice of a fallen comrade promising guidance. A grieving mother might dream of her dead child offering comfort, her voice just a little too sweet, a little too sharp. These are not hallucinations. They are calculated breaches, cracks in the walls of sanity where the warp seeps through. To resist is agony. The siege of the soul does not rely on brute force, it relies on patience. Imagine a besieged fortress, walls battered not by constant cannon fire, but by the steady grind of hunger and thirst. The defenders grow weaker every day. They will test it until the gates are opened from within. In the same way, chaos besieges the soul, wearing down faith, sowing doubt, offering temptations at just the right moment. The gods do not need to shatter the gates. They wait until the mortal unlocks them willingly. The Inquisition keeps grim records of those broken by this slow torment. In one case, a loyal commissar named Varric resisted interrogation by chaos cultists for months, refusing food, refusing even water. He withstood floggings, demonic hallucinations, and the screams of his dying men. But on the final day, when his body was weak and trembling, a voice whispered, "I can give you the strength to save them. Just say my name." He did not even realize he had spoken until the chains fell from his wrists, and his captors bowed before him as their new champion. His soul had been conquered not by force, but by exhaustion. That is the genius of chaos. It does not need to kill the strong. It needs only to wait until strength fades. And because humanity is mortal, strength always fades. Fear, despair, grief, these are the cracks in the armor. Where the Imperium demands endless faith and obedience, chaos offers immediate relief. Why suffer in silence when the gods will hear you? Why cling to duty when power is a whisper away? For a weary soul, such questions feel like lifelines. But each answer ties another link in the chain. The siege of the soul is perhaps most dangerous because it spreads unseen. One corrupted soul does not remain isolated, it becomes a seed. A converted priest spreads a new doctrine cloaked in familiar hymns. A broken soldier shares his blessing with comrades. Even a grieving family can spread taint by clinging to a relic infused with warp energy. The siege of one soul becomes the downfall of hundreds, then thousands. By the time the Inquisition realizes the threat, an entire planet may already be compromised. And yet, there is hope, though it is as grim as the galaxy itself. Some souls endure. There are stories of guardsmen who resist to their final breath, never bending, never yielding. There are psychers who burn out their own minds rather than let the warp claim them. And there are even rare tales of mortals who glimpse the gods and turn away, scarred but unbroken. These are exceptions, not the rule, but they remind humanity that chaos, though mighty, is not absolute. The true battlefield lies not in the warp or the stars, but in the heart that dares to resist. But resistance has a cost. To defy chaos is to live in constant suspicion, to guard every thought, to reject every comfort. The Imperium teaches its citizens to pray without ceasing, to confess their doubts, to purge themselves of weakness before weakness can be exploited. Entire worlds are built around rituals of vigilance, morning litanies, evening penance, daily sacrifices. To live in the Imperium is to accept that the soul itself is a fortress under permanent siege, its gates never safe, its walls always in danger of cracking. Thus, humanity lives in a paradox. To survive, it must harden itself against temptation, even at the cost of joy, compassion, or individuality. Every smile, every dream, every ambition carries risk. The siege of the soul is not just a weapon of chaos, it is the shadow cast over every human life. For in a galaxy where the gods are always listening, how can one be certain that even their most private thoughts are truly their own? The siege of the soul may be fought within, but when enough souls are lost, the consequences spill into the physical world. That was the fate of Bastion Veridus, a fortress city on the frontier of the Segmentum Obscura, once a proud stronghold of the Astra Militarum. It became a cautionary tale whispered by commissars and priests, a city that stood strong against 1,000 enemies, yet crumbled from within when chaos finally breached its walls. The bastion was designed to be impregnable. Its walls stretched for miles, reinforced with ceramite and adamantine. Dozens of defense batteries scanned the skies, and entire regiments of guardsmen garrisoned its halls. Even the smallest chapel within Veridus echoed with hymns to the god Emperor. For decades, it was a beacon of imperial defiance, the first line of defense against marauders and Xenos raiders. From the outside, it appeared unshakable, but walls and cannons mean little when the rot begins at the heart. Chaos had not assaulted Veridus with demons or legions. It had sent whispers, carried on warp currents that slipped into the dreams of its citizens. At first, the changes were imperceptible. A priest altered the litany of devotion by a single word. A guard officer began wearing a medallion he claimed was a family heirloom, though its design was alien to Imperial heraldry. Workers painted strange symbols in the underhives, claiming they were protective charms. No alarms were raised. No inquisitors came. By the time the Inquisition's eyes turned to Veridis, the city was already compromised. Entire battalions had pledged themselves to a god they could not name. Families offered secret sacrifices in cellars and basements. What had once been a fortress of faith became a staging ground for heresy. Yet the true horror came when the first Chaos Space Marines arrived. The sky split with warp fire as a warband of the Word-Bearers descended, their ships tearing through the void with unnatural speed. They did not come as conquerors, they came as liberators, greeted by citizens who had already turned. The gates of Veridis opened not under bombardment, but under celebration. Guardsmen who had sworn to defend the Imperium now raised their rifles in salute to the dark gods. For those few who resisted, the nightmare was unthinkable. Commissar Orin, one of the last loyalists, described the fall in a message box later recovered from the ruins. We did not fight Xenos, nor beasts, nor traitors of distant blood. We fought our brothers, our children, our wives, and we lost. Not because they were stronger, but because they believed. The word-bearers wasted no time. The great cathedrals of Veridis were defiled, their golden statues reshaped into grotesque icons of the warp. Sacrificial fires burned in the plazas, where thousands chanted praises to gods that demanded only more blood. Chaos Marines stalked the streets like demigods, clad in crimson armor etched with scripture, each one a living sermon of corruption. The defenders who remained loyal were hunted with terrifying precision. Cornered in tunnels, dragged screaming from bunkers, and offered as sacrifices. And yet, the darkest part of Veridis's fall was not the slaughter. It was the willingness of so many to embrace it. Parents offered their own children to the word-bearers, believing they would be rewarded. Officers betrayed their comrades, convinced they would rise as champions. Even administratum scribes, the lowest clerks, forgotten and despised, turned gleefully to chaos when promised recognition by the gods. The siege was not a battle. It was a revelation. Chaos had not only conquered the city, it had convinced the city to conquer itself. When Imperial reinforcements finally arrived, summoned by desperate astropathic pleas, they found only ruins. The once mighty walls of Veridis were blackened with warp fire. The city's spires had collapsed into molten heaps. The vox channels were filled with chanting that drove listeners to madness. Worse, the word-bearers had already departed, leaving behind a husk of a world stripped of faith and hope. Veridis was not simply destroyed, was repurposed. A shrine to chaos that bled corruption into the stars around it. The Imperium's official record lists Bastion Veridis as lost to the warp, but survivors who fled through smuggler routes tell darker tales. They claim that the city still stands, half in real space and half in the warp, its streets echoing with the voices of the damned. They claim that the souls of those who surrendered still walk the alleys, chanting endless prayers to gods that feast on their agony. Veridis, they say, was not lost, it was transformed. For the Imperium, the fall of Veridis was more than a military defeat. It was proof of Chaos's greatest weapon, not its demons, not its warbands, but its ability to turn faith itself against its makers. A bastion designed to resist any foe fell without a single wall breach, not by force of arms, but by the corruption of the human spirit. And if Veridis could fall, then any world could. The tragedy of Bastion Veridus is told again and again, not as comfort, but as warning. For chaos does not always come with fire and steel. Sometimes it comes with whispers, with promises, with prayers that sound almost familiar. And when the gates finally fall, they are not pushed open, they are invited. The fall of Bastion Veridus was not total in its first moments. Amid the betrayal and bloodshed, pockets of resistance still burned with loyalty to the Emperor. These were not soldiers hardened by decades of war, nor mighty space marines, but simple men and women who refused to let their faith be corrupted. In their defiance, they lit the final sparks of hope. Even as the storm of chaos consumed everything around them, deep within the industrial quarter of Veridus, where manufacturums had once churned out munitions for the Imperial Guard, a handful of survivors barricaded themselves inside a cathedral factory. Its walls, layered with steel and stained glass, became their final redoubt. The defenders were few, barely 200 guardsmen, a scattering of priests and civilians clutching improvised weapons. At their head stood Commissar Oren, his coat torn, his bolt pistol cracked, but his voice unbroken. "Brothers and sisters," he shouted as the chanting of cultists grew louder outside the walls. "We are the Emperor's last line here. If we fall, Veridus is lost. Better to die in his light than to live in the filth of heresy. Hold fast and know that the Emperor watches." The defenders roared in reply, their cries rising above the drums of chaos. They knew what awaited them. There would be no retreat, no salvation. But they also knew that their sacrifice would delay the enemy, buying precious hours for the astropaths to complete their desperate signal for aid. The assault began at dusk. From the shattered manufacturum gates surged waves of cultists, their bodies twisted by mutation, their faces painted with blood. They carried stub rifles and rusted blades, screaming praises to their dark gods. The defenders answered with disciplined volleys of lasgun fire, their beams carving through the mob with mechanical precision. For every heretic that fell, 2 more scrambled over the corpses, shrieking in ecstasy at the carnage. Then the sky itself trembled. The walls shook as the first of the Chaos Space Marines advanced, a towering word-bearer clad in crimson armor, his shoulder plates inscribed with scripture that burned with warp flame. Bolt of fire thundered, shattering statues and pulping defenders where they stood. Against such monsters, lasguns were little more than pinpricks, but still the guardsmen fired, their faith carrying them even as their fear grew unbearable. Hours passed like days. The floor of the cathedral ran slick with blood. Priests sang hymns over the roar of gunfire, their voices ragged but unyielding. Civilians carried ammunition to the walls, even as shells burst above their heads. Each moment was bought with lives, but the resistance held. For a time, it seemed possible, just possible, that the Emperor's light would outlast the darkness. But chaos is patient, and its champions tireless. As midnight fell, the word-bearers launched their true assault. From the shadows came demons, shrieking horrors pulled screaming from the warp, their claws rending steel like parchment. The defenders faltered, their prayers turning to screams as reality itself split open around them. Commissar Oren drew his chainsword and fought at the vanguard, cleaving through cultists and striking even at demons with fury born of despair. He knew he would die. They all did, but their deaths would matter. At the height of the battle, as the walls began to collapse and the faithful were driven back to the altar, Oren raised his voice one last time. The Emperor protects. Even now he watches. Let us die with his name on our lips. The survivors echoed him, voices rising in a final crescendo that shook even the warped faith of their enemies. The last moments of the resistance were a blur of blood and fire. Civilians hurled themselves at Chaos Marines with knives and bare hands, buying seconds for comrades to fire one more volley. Priests immolated themselves with promethium, dragging demons into flame. Commissar Orin, surrounded on all sides, fought until his chainsword shattered, then drew his knife and carved until he was torn apart by dawn. The cathedral factory was a ruin, its walls broken, its altar defiled. No defender remained alive, yet their sacrifice was not meaningless. Hours later, an Imperial fleet picked up the astropathic cry for aid, carrying word of Veridus's fall to the wider Imperium. The galaxy would know of their stand. Their names would not be remembered, but their faith would echo in every guardsman who heard the tale, that even in the heart of corruption, humanity can burn brighter than the warp's endless night. The word-bearers, in their arrogance, mocked the last stand. They painted the cathedral's ruins with the blood of the faithful, proclaiming it a shrine to their gods. But the truth, whispered in secret among Imperial soldiers, was different. They said that the spirits of Veridus's defenders still lingered, unseen, their final hymn echoing across the void. The Emperor protects, and in that hymn even the damned might tremble. When the flames of Bastion Veridus burned low and the screams of the last defenders faded into silence, the victors stalked the ruins in satisfaction. The word-bearers had claimed another fortress for their gods, and the cultists howled in triumph. To them, the battle was over. Yet, in the smoking rubble of the Manufactorum Cathedral, one man still lived, though he wished he hadn't. His name was Tavian Crail, a lowly guardsman drafted from Veridus's underhives. He had never seen battle before the siege. When the cultists rose, he followed his sergeant. When the commissar gave his final speech, he shouted with the others. When the cathedral fell, Tavian was buried under a collapsed section of wall, pinned and broken, but alive. For 3 days, he lay in the darkness, sustained only by drops of rain leaking through shattered stone. He listened as cultists laughed above him, dragging bodies for sacrifice. He heard the heavy tread of chaos, Marines echoing like thunder. He prayed for death, but chaos is crueler than that. On the 4th day, the rubble shifted. A crimson-armored giant stood above him, eyes burning like coals beneath a horned helm. A word-bearer, etched with scripture in a language Tavian could not understand. The Marines studied him not with malice, but with curiosity, as though Tavian were an insect spared by chance. With a gesture, the cultists dragged him from the ruins and bound him. He was no longer a defender. He was a trophy. The word-bearers had no interest in killing him. Death was too merciful. Instead, Tavian was paraded through the ruins of his home. He saw temples desecrated, their golden statues hammered into grotesque shapes. He saw children painted in blood, chanting hymns that made his skin crawl. He saw the remains of his comrades nailed to the walls as warnings. Every sight was a dagger in his soul. The Marines called him the Witness. They fed him scraps, kept him alive, and forced him to watch every atrocity. When they raised altars to their gods, Tavion was placed at the front to see the blood spill. When they summoned demons, he was made to stand as the veil of reality split before his eyes. He was not meant to die, he was meant to remember, and in remembering, chaos believed it had planted a seed. For weeks, Tavian endured. His prayers became hoarse, his faith frayed. He wanted to shut his eyes, but the cultists pried them open with metal hooks. He wanted to scream, but they gagged him until the rituals ended. Every moment was designed to break him, to hollow him out until he became one of them. Yet he did not yield. Somewhere deep inside, the words of Commissar Oren echoed still. Better to die in his light than to live in the filth of heresy. But Tavian did not die when the word-bearers finally departed Veridus. They left Tavian alive, bound to a post in the ruins. They knew the Imperium would come. They knew the survivors of the relief fleet would find him. And they knew what he would bring back with him. Not victory, not hope, but memory. A witness to horror, carrying the infection of doubt back to the Imperium. When the Imperial fleet finally set foot upon Veridus's ashes, they found him delirious, his eyes wild. He was taken aboard, examined by Medicae, and interrogated by His words were confused, his voice cracked. But the images he painted chilled every listener. The laughter of children chanting to chaos. The endless scripture on the Marine's armor. The sound of demons shrieking through broken reality. The Inquisition took him next. They debated whether to purge him immediately, fearing corruption. But Tavian passed every psychic scan. No demon clung to his soul. No taint infected his blood. He was, by every measure, uncorrupted. Yet the Inquisitors could not help but wonder why had the word-bearers left him alive. The answer, Tavian himself suspected. He had not been spared. He had been used. He was not only a survivor, but a message. Wherever he went, his memories would carry with them the weight of chaos. His voice would spread despair. His visions would sow doubt. He had become a weapon of the very enemy he hated. Still, the Imperium made its choice. Tavian was inducted into the ranks of the Schola Progenium, not as a soldier, but as a cautionary tale. He travelled from world to world, recounting what he had seen, teaching recruits to fear chaos with every breath. His words broke spirits and forged resolve in equal measure. Some recruits wept and begged for release from service. Others hardened their hearts, swearing vengeance on the traitor legions. And Tavian carried on, a man torn between his faith and his trauma, knowing that the word-bearers were laughing at him from across the stars. For he was their unwilling witness, their eternal reminder to the Imperium. Chaos does not always kill. Sometimes it lets you live. Tavian Crail had been many things in his short life, hive-born drudge. Conscripted guardsman, unwilling survivor of a nightmare. But now, in the cold stone halls of the Schola Progenium, he had become something stranger still, a living relic. The instructors did not see him as a man. They saw him as a tool, a voice to frighten cadets, a reminder of what awaited the careless every night. Recruits sat in silence as Tavian stood before them, his frame gaunt, his eyes sunken, his voice hoarse yet unyielding. He told them of the rituals, of children painted in blood, of the word-bearer's scripture that seemed to shift and writhe as though alive. He spoke of demons clawing their way through tears in reality, of comrades nailed to walls, of prayers drowned beneath laughter. His words painted pictures too vivid to dismiss. Some cadets left those lectures trembling, barely able to grip their lasguns. Others clenched their jaws in silent rage, swearing never to falter. The instructors said this was Tavian's gift. But Tavian himself did not believe it was a gift at all. He knew, deep down, that every word he spoke carried the stain of chaos. The word-bearers had not spared him out of mercy. They had made him a vessel, a courier of despair. With every retelling, the memories became sharper, the details clearer. Sometimes he wondered if he was even remembering at all, if the visions were being whispered back into his mind from some unseen place beyond. Reality, the nights were the worst. Alone in his quarters, Tavian dreamt. He dreamt of crimson giants chanting praises in the dark tongue, their armored fists dripping with the blood of innocents. He dreamt of the Manufacturum Cathedral burning, its spire twisting into an obscene parody of the Aquila. And he dreamt of the word-bearer who had first pulled him from the Rubula nameless figure, scripture etched into every inch of his armor. In the dreams that Marines spoke to him, though Tavian could not understand the words, the sound was like knives in his mind, like scripture written in fire across his skull. He would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, clutching his rosary beads until his knuckles turned white. The Inquisition noticed. Interrogator Serenval of the Ordo Hereticus began attending his lectures, sitting in the shadows. She questioned him afterward, not about his memories, but about his dreams. Her eyes were cold, sharp as a blade. She wanted to know if the visions were simply trauma or something more. Tavian feared to answer, but he told her the truth. The dreams felt real, as if he were being watched, as if the word-bearers were still reaching for him across the void. "Then you are no mere witness," Vol told him one night. "You are a conduit." The word chilled him more than any nightmare. Soon, Tavian's role shifted. No longer was he paraded before recruits. Instead, he was kept under constant surveillance by the Inquisition. Psychers tested him daily, probing his mind for weakness, for taint, for hidden whispers. He passed their tests, yet each time he emerged weaker, more exhausted. He began to doubt himself. What if he was already corrupted and simply too blind to see it? What if the Inquisition was keeping him alive only to study how long it would take for him to fall? The dreams grew stronger now. When he closed his eyes, he saw not only Veridus, but worlds he did not know. Planets burning under a crimson sky. Vast legions of Chaos Marines chanting in unison. And always, at the center, the same word-bearer, the one who had spared him. His armor gleamed wet with blood, and from his helm came a voice Tavian could almost understand. One night, the voice spoke words in low Gothic. "You are mine." Tavian awoke to find his rosary shattered in his hand, its beads scattered across the floor. By then, the Inquisition had decided he was too dangerous to remain in the school. He was transferred aboard a black ship, chained within a warded cell. There, he was surrounded by psychers who screamed in their sleep, by the humming of Geller wards that kept demons at bay. Tavian was not told where the ship was headed. He suspected Terra, perhaps, or some fortress monastery where his fate would be sealed. Days turned to weeks. Tavian stopped sleeping altogether, terrified of what awaited him in his dreams. His body weakened, but his mind remained sharp, kept awake by fear alone. He began scratching words into the walls with his fingernails, fragments of scripture, half-remembered prayers, sometimes nonsense syllables he could not explain. The wardens grew uneasy. It was then that Tavian realized the cruelest truth. He was no longer just remembering the word-bearers' chants. He was repeating them. Words he had never understood now rolled from his tongue as easily as breath. He wept in silence, begging the Emperor for forgiveness. But deep down, he wondered if forgiveness was even possible. And across the Imperium, the word-bearers surely laughed, for their plan was unfolding as intended. Tavian was no soldier, no champion. He was a message in flesh, carried into the very heart of the Imperium. Every word he spoke, every dream he suffered, Every whisper he could not silence each was a seed that, in time, might grow. The Imperium believed Tavian was a warning. The truth was far darker. He was a weapon, and the galaxy had not yet seen the wound he would carve. The corridors of the black ship were silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a grave, thick and suffocating. Tavian Krail felt it pressing down on him as the Geller fields hummed faintly in the background, their sacred machinery straining to keep the warp at bay. He had heard whispers from the guards. This ship carried thousands of scythers, gathered like cattle to be delivered unto the Emperor. And now he was among them not as a scyther, but as something far stranger. His cell was small, its walls etched with wards that glowed faintly whenever he neared them. He could feel their power prickling against his skin, like invisible needles pressing into his flesh. The Inquisition had left no risk untended. He was watched at all times, guards posted outside the heavy doors. Psyker wards trained on him as if he were a ticking bomb, and perhaps he was. The dreams had not ceased. If anything, they had grown worse. In sleep, Tavian saw worlds consumed by flame. He saw imperial cities twisting into shrines of chaos, their cathedrals crowned not with aquilers, but with 8 pointed stars. He saw the word-bearer who had spared him standing atop a mountain of skulls, scripture blazing across his armor, his voice echoing in Tavian's skull even when he was awake. "You are mine." The words never left him. One night, Tavian woke to find his cell door open. The guards were gone. The wards had dimmed to faint embers. For a moment, he thought it was another dream. But no, the cold stone floor beneath his bare feet was real. The stench of recycled air real. The distant sound of chanting echoing down the corridor far too real. He stumbled forward, half mad with fear. The chanting grew louder, voices rising in the dark tongue. And then he saw them. A cluster of psychers, their eyes rolled back, their bodies trembling as if puppeteered by unseen hands. They had broken their restraints, their mouths spilling scripture they could not possibly know. The words of chaos, and at the center of them stood Interrogator Seren Vol. Her eyes burned with psychic fire as she barked commands, her rosette glowing with authority. Wards flared around her, barely holding the demonic presence at bay. She saw Tavian and screamed at him, "Back! Stay back!" But it was too late. The psychers collapsed as one, their bodies writhing on the floor. Tavian felt the warp ripple through the ship like a storm. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and somewhere deep within the vessel, something laughed. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as visions flooded him. He saw terror itself burning. He saw the golden throne collapse. He saw the Astronomicon gutter like a dying flame. And through it all, he heard the word-bearer's voice. "You carry our truth into their heart. The seed is sown." When Tavian awoke, he was back in his cell. Guards surrounded him, their weapons trained on his chest. Vol stood among them, her expression unreadable. She had not allowed the guards to kill him. "Yet, you are not just a witness," she told him. "You are an echo. They left their mark on you, Tavian Krail. Perhaps you are even their message. But we will decide how that message ends." From that day, Tavian was no longer treated as a prisoner. He was treated as an experiment. Inquisitors and psychers alike studied him, probing his mind, pushing him to the brink of madness to see what lay beneath. Sometimes he resisted. Sometimes he broke. Each time he felt the word-bearer's grip tighten, as though the marine's gauntlet hand reached across the warp to clutch his soul, and Tavian realized a terrible truth. The black ship was not his salvation. It was his crucible. The Inquisition was not trying to silence him. They were trying to weaponize him. His memories, his visions, his very existence, these could be forged into a tool against chaos, or, if they miscalculated, into a dagger in the Imperium's heart. The fate of billions might depend on which path prevailed. The black ship drifted through the void, its engines a dull hum against the infinite silence of space. But inside, silence was long dead. Tavian Crail lay on the cold floor of his cell, sweat dripping down his face, visions pounding through his skull. The word-bearer's voice had grown louder each day. No longer confined to dreams, it now whispered into his every waking moment. It is time. Speak the truth. The Imperium is weak. You have seen it. You have lived it. He pressed his hands to his ears, though it did nothing. The whispers weren't heard. They were felt, etched into his bones like fire. Outside his chamber, alarms screamed. The ship was under siege, not from without, but from within. Psychers had broken free again, their minds shattered by the weight of the warp. Possession spread like wildfire, demonic claws scratching at the thin skin of reality. Interrogator Vol stormed into Tavian's cell, her armor scorched, her rosette glowing as if in defiance of the dark. She pointed her weapon at him. It's happening, Crail. They're coming through. And you, her voice shook for the first time, you might be the breach or the key. Tell me where your loyalties lie. Tavian staggered to his feet, his legs trembling. He wanted to say, the Imperium. He wanted to say humanity, but the visions that filled his mind showed him only ruin. Worlds burning, men and women kneeling before demonic idols, the Astronomicon fading, the Imperium collapsing under its own rot. The word-bearer appeared in his sight tool, armored, haloed in unholy light, though no one else could see him. His voice was thunder. You are ours. You have carried our truth this far. Do not falter now. Speak, and you will be remade as eternal. Vol shouted, fight it. Fight them, Tavian. Her words were drowned in the storm. Tavia and screamed. His mind tore in two directions. On one side, Vol, her eyes filled with desperate conviction. The Imperium, flawed, corrupt, brutal, but still the last line of defense against eternal damnation. On the other, the word-bearer, promising release from pain, offering clarity in a universe of endless suffering. Chaos. The ship shook violently. Bulkheads burst open as warp energy flooded the hallways. Demons clawed their way into reality, shrieking laughter filling the air. Guards fought desperately, lost fire crackling, but the tide was unstoppable, and in the middle of it all stood Tavian. He understood then, he was not just a witness. He was the knife edge of destiny. His choice would tip the scales, perhaps only here on this single ship, but perhaps far beyond. He closed his eyes. For a long, agonizing moment, there was silence. When he opened them again, his voice was calm. Option A. Tragic chaos ending. Tavian turned to Vol, but his words were not hers to hear. His mouth opened, and the dark tongue poured out liquid fire, syllables that cracked the air itself. The wards on the ship shattered. The Gellerfield collapsed. The warp flooded in. Demons swarmed the corridors like locusts, tearing flesh from bone. The black ship became a cathedral of horror, screams echoing until they were drowned by the laughter of the dark gods. Vol fought until her body was broken, but it was futile, and Tavian became still. His eyes burned with unholy light. The word-bearer's voice became his own. He was no longer Tavion Crail. He was the mouthpiece of chaos, carrying its gospel into the heart of humanity. The Imperium had lost another son to the darkness. Option B. Sacrificial Imperium, ending. Tavian fell to his knees, clutching his skull, and screamed not in surrender, but in defiance. He forced the word-bearer's voice back, inch by agonizing inch, until his throat bled with the effort. I am not yours. The demon within howled, clawing at his mind. But Tavian reached deep into the warp taint festering inside him and turned it outward. His body became a conduit, a living pyre of psychic flame. For one moment, he was not the victim, but the weapon. The demons shrieked as holy fire engulfed the corridors. Warp entities disintegrated, their forms torn apart by the backlash. The Geller field reignited, stabilized by his sacrifice. The ship held. When the light faded, Tavian's body was ash. Nothing of him remained but a scorch mark on the floor. Vol, bloodied and broken, bowed her head. He had chosen humanity not out of loyalty to the Imperium, but out of defiance against the monsters who sought to own his soul. And in that final act, Tavian Crail, once a hunted civilian, had become something greater than even a space marine. He had become a man who chose. The ship limped onward through the void, its prisoners silent, its crew shaken. Word would spread of the nameless man who either damned them or saved them. And somewhere in the warp, a word-bearer whispered in the shadows, "Even in death, the game continues."